If you've been following our deep dives into royal history, you'll know the last Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, didn't just have one queen. We've already unpacked the lives of his second wife, Soraya, and his third and final empress, Farah. But before either of them, there was another woman at his side, a woman who was both an Iranian queen and an Egyptian princess, and whose life moved from palaces and crowns to quiet anonymity by the sea. Today we're looking at Princess Fawzia of Egypt, the first queen of the Pahlavi dynasty. For a while, she stood at the very top of two monarchies. In the end, she walked away from both and remarkably found more peace as a private citizen than she ever did on a throne. Princess Fawzia was born on November 5, 1921 in Alexandria, Egypt, the second child of King Fuad I of Egypt and his second wife, Queen Nazli Sabri. Her ancestry reflected the mixed, cosmopolitan nature of the Egyptian elite at the time. Through her father, she had Albanian roots. On her mother's side, there was Turkish, French, and Circassian, Caucasian heritage. That mix, plus exceptional genes, produced a woman who became famous across continents for her looks. British photographer Cecil Beaton, who worked with many of the world's most glamorous women, once dubbed her the Venus of the East. He described her as having a perfectly heart-shaped face, an almost unreal pale complexion, and striking blue eyes that shone like jewels. In Western media, she was frequently compared to film legends like Hedy Lamarr and Vivien Leigh. Even in an era full of glamorous royals, Fawzia stood out. Her upbringing was a blend of East and West. As a child, she and her siblings were raised in large part by an English nanny, which shaped her manners and language. Egypt itself, especially in elite circles, was relatively liberal at the time, and Fawzia spent part of her education in Switzerland. By the time she was a teenager, she moved easily in a westernized environment. French, English, and European etiquette came naturally. But once she returned home to Egypt, her life narrowed dramatically. Being a royal princess in King Fuad's household meant rigid control and constant supervision. Her mother, Queen Nazli, who had seen her own freedoms sharply limited by her husband, was extremely strict with her daughters. Fawzia and her sisters were rarely alone outside the palace. Whenever they went anywhere, they were accompanied by a full entourage of guards and attendants. Outwardly, she lived in splendor. In reality, her movements and choices were tightly restricted. When Fawzia was 18, her life took a decisive turn. Her brother, King Farouk, had succeeded their father and was now ruling Egypt. The political climate in the region was tense, with Britain exerting strong influence over both Egypt and Iran. To counter some of that pressure and boost Egypt's standing in the Muslim world, Farouk agreed to a strategic marriage. His sister would wed the crown prince of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, 2 years her senior. It was a textbook dynastic alliance. On paper, it linked Cairo and Tehran, the Nile and the Persian plateau, in a way that could rebalance regional prestige. For Fawzia, it was also presented as an opportunity, a way out of a tightly monitored life in Egypt into what she hoped might be a more autonomous one abroad. The two young royals had barely met. They reportedly saw each other only 2 days before the first wedding ceremony. Physically, they were pleased with one another. He was a handsome, European-educated prince. She was already a celebrated beauty. Fawzia is believed to have looked at the match less as a love connection and more as a possible escape route. If she became queen elsewhere, perhaps she would finally gain some personal freedom. Their first wedding took place on March 15, 1939 at Abdeen Palace in Cairo. It was a major event for both countries. After that ceremony, Fawzia traveled to Iran accompanied by her mother, Queen Nazli, and 2 of her sisters. In Tehran, a second extended wedding celebration was held at the Marble Palace, lasting 7 days. The details of the banquet underline just how determined both courts were to showcase abundance and sophistication. The menu was French in style: Caspian Sea caviar, clear consommé, fish courses, poultry, lamb, stuffed vine leaves, apricot and nut pastries, delicate honey cakes, pheasant breast with artichokes, chestnuts, and elaborate seafood towers layered with prawns, caviar, and truffles. To
To mark the royal occasion, the Iranian state even granted amnesty to certain prisoners and distributed food and money to the poor, using the wedding as a public relations gesture. But if the celebrations were lush, Fawzia's first impressions of Iran were not. Compared to cosmopolitan Cairo and Alexandria, Tehran in 1939 felt provincial and underdeveloped. Fawzia is said to have felt as though she had been banished rather than married off. She found her new surroundings rougher, more austere, and far less glamorous than the royal Egypt she knew. She was particularly unimpressed by her father-in-law, Reza Shah, a military strongman who had built the Pahlavi dynasty through force and modernization. He came across to her as blunt and uncouth. The palaces in Tehran looked old-fashioned and less refined than the airy European-influenced residences of Cairo. Even the food bothered her. She was used to French cuisine and refined Egypt dishes. The heavy, unfamiliar Iranian fare did not suit her palate. Underneath those surface differences, there was a deeper problem. This was at its core a political marriage, not a romantic one. There was very little emotional foundation to begin with, and several practical barriers made it harder to build one. Fawzia did not speak Persian, and Mohammad Reza did not speak Arabic. The only language they had in common was French, which became their default way of talking to each other. It was workable, but it was also one more reminder that their worlds rarely overlapped naturally. Their personalities were misaligned as well. The young crown prince, later Shah, liked socializing, entertaining, and the attention that came with his role. He could be charming, but he also had a clear taste for the playboy lifestyle. Fawzia, on contrast, was more reserved and private. She did not enjoy constant court ceremonies or glittering society events. What might have looked like shyness to some was really a preference for quieter, controlled spaces. Any chance for an easy life in Iran was further complicated by the Pahlavi family dynamics. Mohammad Reza's mother was intensely possessive of his son and reportedly struggled to accept any woman who captured too much of his time and affection. For a daughter-in-law trying to find her footing in a foreign royal court, that was a serious obstacle. Relations with his sisters weren't much better. Tensions and arguments broke out frequently. In one particularly shocking incident, later recalled in accounts of the period, a quarrel with one of his sisters escalated so badly that the sister smashed a vase on Fawzia's head. The physical violence was one thing. The emotional violence came afterward, when Mohammad Reza seemed largely unmoved by what had happened and failed to properly defend his wife. For Fawzia, that signaled a deep lack of respect.
She also disliked Iran's climate. Between the weather, the cultural differences, the language barrier, the in-law conflicts, and the lack of understanding from her husband, the pressure mounted. Over time, she sank into depression. Eventually, she withdrew from many royal duties and became less visible in public life. In the second year of the marriage, Fawzia gave birth to a child, a daughter. Mohammad Reza, to his credit, was genuinely pleased and proud. He named the baby Shahnaz, meaning pride of the king. But his father, Reza Shah, reacted very differently. He had expected a male heir and was furious that the first royal grandchild was not a boy. Celebrations that had been prepared in advance were abruptly cancelled. The message was clear: a girl was not good news. Fawzia was deeply offended. As tensions with her father-in-law intensified, she reportedly refused to allow him to visit his granddaughter. Whatever small warmth there might have been between the families cooled further. Years later, Mohammad Reza himself would say that the only truly happy period of their marriage was the time immediately surrounding their daughter's birth. Outside the palace, the Shah's behavior didn't help. He took mistresses and engaged in affairs, something Fawzia became aware of and resented. Meanwhile, her physical health began to suffer. She contracted malaria and faced other health issues, all while her mental state worsened. Depression, illness, and constant stress left her exhausted. She no longer had the energy to care for her young daughter in the way she might have wanted. By 1945, she'd reached her breaking point. That year, Princess Fawzia left Iran and returned to Egypt alone. She had no intention of going back. Once home, she requested a formal divorce from her husband. At first, Mohammad Reza resisted. A divorce was politically awkward, and he did have some attachment to her as the mother of his child.
But ultimately, the need for a son and a fresh marriage path outweighed his reluctance. He agreed to end the marriage, but he set a major condition. Their daughter, Shahnaz, would remain in Iran under his guardianship. Custody, he insisted, would not follow the mother. It took several years to formalize. In 1948, the Iranian authorities finally officially recognized the end of the marriage. The government did what royal courts often do. They wrapped the situation in polite language. The official explanation was that Iran's climate had badly affected Fawzia's health, and out of concern for her well-being, the Shah had magnanimously agreed to dissolve the union. There was no mention of political disappointment, marital unhappiness, or affairs. Interestingly, that same month, Fawzia's brother, King Farouk, also divorced his wife, Queen Farida. In both Egypt and Iran, royal marriages were cracking under the combined strain of personal incompatibility and public expectation. When the divorce was finalized, Fawzia was just 28. She had already been a queen consort, already lost contact with a child, and already retreated from one royal court. But she was still very young, still widely admired for her beauty, and now in a position to make more personal choices. Before long, she did something that changed the entire tone of her life. She remarried, this time for love. Her second husband was Colonel Ismail Chirine, a distant relative and a man very different from her first spouse. Chirine had studied at Trinity College, Cambridge, and had served briefly as Egypt's Minister of War and Navy. Their wedding was modest and intimate compared to the grand spectacle of her first marriage. King Farouk himself presided over the simple ceremony. This second union, by all accounts, was based on genuine affection rather than diplomacy. The couple had a daughter and a son together. With Ismail, Fawzia stepped away from the rigid expectations of queenhood and into something closer to an ordinary upper-class life. In 1952, Egypt's monarchy was overthrown in the revolution led by the Free Officers. King Farouk went into exile, and many members of the extended royal family were forced to leave the country. But Fawzia and her husband were allowed to remain. They settled quietly in a villa in Alexandria, living far from the center of power and largely out of the headlines. Every summer, she and Ismail would travel to Switzerland to see her eldest daughter, Shahnaz, who had grown up in Iran and later abroad. Those trips were a bridge across a divide created by politics and royal protocol, a way for a mother and daughter separated by earlier decisions to maintain some connection. In 1976, Fawzia received an invitation that must have stirred many memories. She was asked to revisit the former royal palace in Alexandria, where she had once lived as an Egyptian princess. Former staff members, having heard she was coming, gathered to see her. Many of them embraced her and wept, moved by the return of a woman who represented a vanished era. During that visit, as she walked through the coronation hall with Iranian architect Kiwan Khosravani, she pointed to a Quran displayed on the wall. Referring to her brother, Farouk, she remarked that she was afraid he had not read all of its verses carefully, implying that if he had truly absorbed its guidance, perhaps they would still be the ruling family. It was a quiet, pointed reflection on how power can be lost through arrogance, misjudgment, or neglect. Later, she summed up her own life in a striking way. She observed that she had lost the crown twice, first as Queen of Iran, then as an Egyptian princess when her own royal house fell. Then she added that now everything is gone, but it no longer matters to her. That line captures something essential about her later years, a woman who had lived through the highest levels of privilege and then watched it all disappear, and who had come to a place where those symbols no longer defined her. Princess Fawzia died in 2013. By then, she had been out of active public life for decades, but news of her passing reignited interest in that lost world of Middle Eastern royalty between the wars and during the early Cold War era. She was, in many ways, the last living link inside Egypt to that royal chapter. Many people posted messages of condolence and remembrance on official and semi-official pages, sharing photos and memories of the Venus of the East, who had once been a queen in Tehran and a princess in Cairo. Looking at her life from a distance, it's easy to divide it into two very different halves. In the first, she is the royal daughter whose path is decided entirely by others. She is pushed into a political marriage with a man she hardly knows, in a country she doesn't understand, among in-laws who don't accept her. She has a title, a tiara, a palace, and yet she is isolated, unhappy, and sliding into depression. In the second half, the titles fall away. She is no longer a queen, no longer an active princess at the center of court life. Instead, she is a wife and mother in a relatively modest villa, a woman who spends summers visiting her daughter and who can walk through her old palace as a guest instead of an occupant. There is less glitter, but there is, by most accounts, much more contentment. For royal watchers, her life is a clear reminder that the outward image of a royal marriage, the diamonds, the processions, the official portraits, rarely shows the full reality. Fawzia's arranged union with the Shah looked perfect in the photographs, but felt like a cage from the inside. It was only when that world collapsed around her and she stepped away from it that she had a chance to build something more genuine. In the end, Princess Fawzia's journey is more than just one queen or one dynasty. It speaks to how power, duty, and personal happiness can pull in different directions. She was born into one royal house, married into another, and watched both of them lose their crowns. Yet somehow, away from the thrones and the titles, she managed to reclaim control over her own life. Sometimes, as people often say, fate closes one elaborate gold-plated door and quietly leaves a much smaller, more simple window open. For Fawzia of Egypt, that smaller window led not to global influence or political power, but to a quieter, more human kind of happiness.